The doctors called him a brain-dead vegetable. The machines did the breathing for him. To the world, Tiang Junxia, the most feared mafia boss in Seoul, was already a ghost. But as his wife and his best friend stood beside his hospital bed, they weren't crying, they were laughing. They thought he couldn't hear them. They thought they could kiss right in front of his face and plan how to spend his billions while his body was still warm. But inside that silent, tattooed cage, the dragon was wide awake, and Tiang Junxia was recording every single word of their betrayal. Tiang had ruled the underworld with an iron fist, but he had one fatal weakness. He loved the wrong woman. He gave Sora a world of diamonds and designer silk, never realizing he was actually funding his own execution. He was trapped, powerless, and marked for death, until a night shift nurse named Zarya noticed the one thing the killers missed: a single blink. Stick around, because today we're diving into a story of a betrayal that went too far, a secret recovery fueled by rage, and a revenge so cold it turned a wedding into a crime scene. Hello, family. Before we dive into the dark twists of Tiang's journey, I want to take a moment to welcome all of you back to the channel. To my returning subscribers, thank you for your incredible support and for riding with me through every story. Your comments and theories keep this community alive, and I truly appreciate you being here. And if you're new to the channel, welcome to the family. Here, we explore the most intense stories of betrayal, hidden power, and redemption. If you enjoy deep emotional arcs and plot twists that keep you guessing until the very last second, you're in the right place. I'd love to know who I'm talking to today. Drop a comment below letting me know which country you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I try to read as many as I can. Now, let's get back to the hospital room where a man everyone thought was a ghost is about to become a nightmare for the people who betrayed him. Let's get into the story. Tiang Junxia did not merely walk through the streets of Seoul. He owned the air that vibrated within them. In the neon-drenched district of Gangnam, where the glass skyscrapers seemed to pierce the very fabric of the heavens, his presence was a silent thunder. He was the dragon of the South, a man whose name was whispered in the back rooms of government offices and the dark alleys of the shipping docks with equal parts reverence and terror. At 35, he had reached a pinnacle of power that most men spent lifetimes failing to glimpse. His physique was a testament to a life of absolute discipline, broad, powerful shoulders that carried the weight of an empire, and a sharp, masculine jawline that never wavered, even when he was staring down the barrel of an assassin's gun. But if one were to look closely at the man behind the myth, they would find the most intricate part of his identity hidden beneath his bespoke Italian silk shirts. Across his chest, a massive, swirling dragon was etched into his skin, its claws clutching his heart, while a serpent coiled around his muscular arm, representing the wisdom and the lethality of his lineage. These tattoos were the marks of his authority, a visual warning that Tiang was a man of total commitment. When he decided to protect something, he was immovable. When he decided to love someone, he was consumed. That evening, the city was blurred by a soft, persistent rain, turning the streetlights into smudged jewels against the pavement. Tiang sat in the back of his armored sedan, his dark, intense eyes fixed on a small velvet box in his hand. Inside sat a rare, pear-cut blue diamond, a gem so clear it looked like a piece of the sky had been frozen in time. It had cost him a small fortune at an auction in Hong Kong, but to Tiang, the price was irrelevant. He was a man who spoke in the language of grand gestures. Because his life was one of violence and shadows, he felt a desperate, almost frantic need to surround his home life with light and luxury. "Sir, we are approaching the estate," his driver, Minho, announced quietly. Tiang nodded, a rare, soft smile tugging at the corners of his stoic mouth. He thought of Sora. To the rest of the world, he was a ruthless predator, but the moment he crossed the threshold of his mansion, he wanted to be nothing more than a husband who provided. He had met Sora Minyi 3 years ago, and from the moment her warm, captivating eyes had met his, he was lost. He saw her as his redemption, a refined, elegant creature who stayed far away from the blood and grease of his business. He took pride in the fact that her hands were soft, and her heart seemed pure. The gates of the Junxia estate swung open, revealing a sprawling architectural masterpiece of stone and glass. As the car pulled up to the entrance, Tiang stepped out, the cool night air biting at his tanned skin. He didn't wait for the staff to take his coat. He moved with a focused energy toward the grand living room. There she was. Sora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her long chestnut brown hair cascading over her shoulders like a silken waterfall. She was wearing a floral black dress that hugged her slim frame, looking every bit the graceful queen of his heart. "You're home early," she said, her voice like honey, as she turned to greet him. Tiang didn't say a word. He simply walked to her and placed the velvet box in her hand. He watched her face, searching for the spark of joy that fueled his own. Sora opened the box, and for a moment the blue diamond caught the light, casting a fractured glow across her beautiful, refined features. "Oh, Tiang, it's magnificent," she whispered, stepping into his arms. He pulled her close, his large, tattooed hand resting gently against her back. He felt a surge of protective pride. He had spent the last week in back-alley negotiations, breaking bones and making threats to ensure his shipping lanes remained secure, all so he could come home and place this symbol of perfection in her hand. He believed that by giving her everything she could ever demand, designer handbags that filled an entire room, shoes that cost more than a common man's yearly salary, and jewels that could buy a city block, he was building a wall between her and the darkness of his world. "Only the best for you, Sora," he murmured against her hair. "You are the only thing that makes all of this worth it." He truly believed those words. His devotion was intense, bordering on a sacred obsession. He didn't just love Sora, he worshipped her as the antithesis of his own violent nature. He saw her grace and her smile as proof that he wasn't just a monster. In his mind, as long as she was happy, as long as she was draped in the finest things the world could offer, he was successful. Little did he know, as he held her in the quiet luxury of their home, that Sora's heartbeat didn't quicken because of his touch, but because of the stone in the box. As she leaned her head against his strong chest, her warm and captivating eyes didn't look at him with love. They looked over his shoulder toward the door, where his best friend, Hyun-sik, would soon appear. Tiang Junseo, the man who could spot a traitor's flinch from a mile away in a boardroom, was completely blind in his own living room. He was the dragon, powerful and feared, yet he was laying himself bare at the feet of a woman who was already measuring the size of his grave. He was a man of absolute loyalty, draped in the finest silk, unaware that his intense, misguided devotion had provided the very tools his enemies would use to destroy him. For Tiang, the diamonds were a promise of forever. For Sora, they were simply the first payment on his life. The betrayal of a king rarely begins with a grand rebellion. It starts in the quiet corners of his own castle, fueled by the very people he has sworn to protect. While Tiang Junseo was miles away, standing on the rain-slicked docks of Incheon and ensuring his empire remained impenetrable, the home he had built as a sanctuary was being desecrated. Inside the sprawling mansion, the air of luxury that Tiang had cultivated with such misplaced pride felt stagnant and heavy with the scent of treachery. Sora Minyi sat in her expansive dressing room, surrounded by the designer handbags and rows of expensive shoes her husband had gifted her, but she didn't look at them with the eyes of a grateful wife. She looked at them with the cold eyes of an accountant evaluating assets. A soft knock at the door broke the silence, a rhythm she recognized instantly. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative footfall of the dragon, but the light, agile step of a man who knew how to move through shadows. Hyun-sik Daryu stepped into the room, his black suit perfectly tailored. His jet-black hair slicked back with an arrogance that mirrored the expensive watch on his wrist, a watch Tiang had placed there himself. He didn't bow or maintain the respectful distance required of a second-in-command. Instead, he walked directly to Sora, his narrow, calculating eyes scanning her with a familiarity that would have turned Tiang's world to ash. Hyun-sik reached out, his fingers tracing the cold line of the blue diamond necklace Tiang had brought home just nights before. "A beautiful collar," he murmured, his voice a sharp contrast to Tiang's gravelly stoicism. "But a collar nonetheless. How long can you wear it before the weight of his love breaks your neck, Sora?" Sora leaned into his touch, her graceful posture yielding to the one man who truly understood her greed. "He thinks he can buy my soul with stones," she replied, her voice dropping the honeyed sweetness she reserved for her husband. "He thinks that because he is the dragon of soul, I should be content to be his ornament. He spends his days in blood and his nights in my bed, talking about a future I have no interest in sharing if I'm only ever second to his syndicate." Their affair had blossomed like a poisonous flower in the fertile soil of shared resentment. Hyun-sik had spent his life in Taeyong's shadow, the loyal brother, who stood 3 steps behind while the world bowed to Jun-seo. He was tired of the crumbs of power. He wanted the throne. And Sora, who had married the legend for the life he could provide, had quickly realized that the legend was far more demanding than the man. They were 2 predators who had found each other in the dark. And now, the thrill of their secret meetings was no longer enough to satisfy the hunger in their bellies. Hyun-sik pulled her closer, his gaze drifting to the window that overlooked the vast estate. He's too disciplined, Sora, too careful. He survives gang wars and assassination attempts because he treats his enemies like monsters. But he treats us like family. That is his only weakness. He paused, a cruel, arrogant smile touching his lips. I saw the way he looked at you tonight. He's completely blinded. He actually believes he is safe here. He doesn't realize that the serpent isn't at his gates. It's already in his house. The shift from adultery to murder was not a leap, but a slow, calculated crawl. For months, they had whispered about what if, but as Taeyong's wealth grew, so did their impatience. Every gift he brought home was a reminder of what they would inherit if he were gone. Every act of his intense, misguided devotion was a reminder of the life they had to fake. The adultery had been a game of passion, but the murder was a business decision. If he dies in the street, the syndicate elders will investigate every rival family, Sora said, her eyes turning cold and calculating as she pulled back to look at Hyun-sik. They'll tear the city apart looking for the killer. We can't have that. It has to be clean. It has to be an act of God or an act of fate. Hyun-sik nodded, his mind already scanning through the possibilities. He was the one who managed the maintenance of the fleet. He was the one who knew Taeyong's schedule to the second. He knew the dragon's habits, the way he drove when he was late, the way he pushed his black sedan to its limits on the open highway. The plan began to take shape between them, woven out of the silk and diamonds Taeyong had provided. They weren't just planning a crime, they were planning a coronation. The Han River Bridge, Hyun-sik whispered, the name of the landmark sounding like a death sentence. The curves are sharp, the speed is high, and the fall is long. If his brakes were to fail, at 200 kilometers per hour, there would be no investigation. Only a tragic accident, a grieving widow, a loyal best friend to step in and steady the ship. Sora smiled, a chillingly beautiful expression that would have broken Taeyong's heart. She reached out and touched Hyun-sik's luxury watch, the one her husband had given him out of love. To the man who keeps my home safe while he's away, she mocked, repeating Taeyong's own words from the night before. They stood together in the heart of Taeyong's sanctuary, 2 vipers coiled in the dark. The man they intended to destroy was currently bleeding for them, fighting for their comfort, and planning his next grand gesture of love. He had built an empire to protect them, never realizing that the greatest threat to his life wasn't the bullet from a rival's gun, but the kiss of the woman in his arms and the handshake of the brother at his side. The serpent was no longer just in the house. It was at his throat, and as the rain continued to fall over Seoul, the countdown to the dragon's fall had officially begun. The darkness that draped over the Jun-seo estate that night was absolute, a thick, suffocating velvet that seemed to swallow the very moonlight. It was a silence that felt heavy with the weight of impending doom, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, low hum of the city. Inside the vast, climate-controlled garage of the mansion, the air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive leather, high-octane fuel, and the metallic tang of perfection. There, resting under the soft glow of recessed LED lights, sat Taeyong's pride, a custom-engineered black sedan. Its paint was so deep and glossy it looked like a pool of obsidian, reflecting nothing but the predatory intent of the man who was about to violate it. A side service door creaked open, just a fraction of an inch. A shadow detached itself from the exterior darkness and slipped inside. This was not the movements of a master assassin or a rival soldier. It was the nervous, hurried shuffle of a man driven by a different kind of desperation. The mechanic, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the grease of 1,000 engines and the shame of a mountain of gambling debts, moved toward the sedan. He didn't look at the security cameras. He didn't need to. Hyun-sik had already ensured the digital eyes of the estate were blind for this 20-minute window. The mechanic knelt by the front driver's side wheel, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. He looked at the car, a marvel of automotive engineering, and felt a fleeting pang of guilt. He knew who this car belonged to. He knew that Tiang Junseo was a man who rewarded precision and punished failure with equal intensity. But the suitcase of cash Sora had promised him was enough to buy a new life, far away from the reach of the syndicate. With trembling hands, he reached into his tool bag and withdrew a pair of heavy-duty industrial shears, their steel blades glinting coldly in the dim light. He reached behind the wheel well, his fingers finding the braided stainless steel line that carried the lifeblood of the car's braking system. In the world of high-performance vehicles, these lines were built to withstand immense pressure, to bite down on the rotors and bring 2 tons of metal to a halt in an instant. They were the thin line between life and death at high speeds. The mechanic positioned the shears. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the weight of what he was about to do settling in his gut like lead. He wasn't just breaking a machine. He was signing a death warrant for the dragon. Snap! The sound was shockingly loud in the cavernous garage, a sharp, metallic crack that echoed off the polished concrete walls. A small spray of pressurized hydraulic fluid hissed out, staining the floor like black blood. The mechanic didn't stop. He moved to the other side, repeating the process with a grim, frantic efficiency. He didn't cut the lines completely through. That would cause a warning light on the dashboard the moment Tiang started the engine. Instead, he scored them deeply, leaving just enough of the metal weave intact to hold under normal pressure. But guaranteed to rupture the moment, the pedal was slammed down with force. He stepped back, wiping his brow with a greasy sleeve. To any casual observer, the sedan looked as magnificent and lethal as ever. Its predatory stance and aggressive lines promised power and speed. But it was no longer a vehicle of luxury. It had been transformed into a sophisticated, 2-ton coffin. It was a masterpiece of deception, perfectly mirroring the state of Tiang's own life. On the outside, everything was polished, expensive, and enviable. On the inside, the systems that were supposed to protect him had been severed at the root. As the mechanic slipped back out into the night, the garage returned to its eerie, silent vigil. The black sedan sat in the center of the room, a silent sentinel of the betrayal that had finally reached its physical manifestation. The leather seats, hand-stitched with the finest thread, would soon be the last thing Tiang felt. The steering wheel, wrapped in carbon fiber, would be the last thing he gripped. The lovers had not used a bomb or a bullet. Those were too loud, too obvious, too easily traced back to the underworld. They had chosen a failure of control, a mechanical tragedy that would leave Sora as the grieving, untouchable widow and Hyun-sik as the loyal protector who would catch her as she fell. The trap was now fully set. The beauty of the black sedan was now a mask for a hollow, deadly void. In a few hours, Tiang would walk into this room, admiring the shine of the paint and the roar of the engine, unaware that he was stepping into a machine designed to fail him at the precise moment he needed it most. The midnight sabotage was complete, and as the first hint of gray light began to touch the Seoul skyline, the countdown to the crash on the Han River Bridge had begun. The dragon's fate was no longer in his own hands. It was dripping slowly onto the garage floor, one dark drop at a time. The dawn air was crisp and biting as Tiang Junseo stepped into the garage, his mind already racing through the logistics of the high-stakes meeting awaiting him across the city. He moved with a predatory grace, the heavy soles of his boots echoing against the polished concrete. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't see the faint, dark shimmer of hydraulic fluid that had been hastily wiped away but remained as a ghostly stain on the tiles. He only saw the black sedan, its obsidian paint gleaming under the overhead lights like a mirror reflecting his own power. To Tiang, this car was more than a machine. It was an extension of his will, a vessel of steel and carbon fiber that had carried him through 1,000 storms. He climbed into the driver's seat, the scent of expensive Italian leather rising to meet him, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural snarl that vibrated in his chest, promising speed and absolute control. He checked his watch, the luxury timepiece Hyun-sik had worn only hours before, and realized he was behind schedule. Precision was the foundation of his empire, and Tiang detested being late. He shifted into gear and rolled out of the estate, the heavy iron gate swinging open to let the dragon pass one last time. As he hit the main highway leading toward the heart of Seoul, the city was a blur of neon signs and gray morning mist. He felt a surge of adrenaline, that familiar sharp edge that came with pushing himself to the limit. He didn't know that every time he shifted gears, every time he lightly tapped the brakes to navigate through early traffic, the scored metal lines beneath his feet were weeping. The pressure was building, the microscopic cracks in the stainless steel weave expanding with every movement, waiting for the one moment of extreme force that would turn them into shrapnel. The road ahead cleared as he approached the long, sweeping stretch of the Han River Bridge. The bridge was a masterpiece of modern engineering, a gray ribbon of asphalt suspended over the churning, dark waters below. Tiang looked at the speedometer. 120 km/h. He pressed the accelerator deeper, the turbocharged engine responding with a violent surge of power. 140, 160, 180. The wind whipped past the windows in a deafening howl, and the world outside became a streaked canvas of light and shadow. He felt invincible. In his mind, he was already at the meeting, closing the deal, returning home to Sara with another victory to lay at her feet. He was a man who believed he had mastered his fate, unaware that his fate had already been severed in the dark of his own garage. Then the nightmare began. A sudden, erratic movement from a heavy transport truck ahead forced Tiang to react. It was a maneuver he had performed 1,000 times, a sharp swerve combined with a firm, decisive application of the brakes. He shifted his foot and slammed the pedal down. For a microsecond, he felt the resistance he expected. Then, there was a sickening, hollow pop from beneath the floorboards. The brake pedal didn't just give way. It collapsed entirely, hitting the floor with a metallic clang that sounded like a gunshot. Tiang's heart plummeted. He pumped the pedal frantically, but there was nothing, just a terrifying, empty void where his control used to be. The car, now a 2-ton missile traveling at 200 km/h, screamed forward. The steering wheel, usually so responsive, felt like a lead weight in his hands as the tires struggled to maintain grip without the stabilizing force of the braking system. He tried to downshift, to let the engine's compression slow the beast, but the momentum was too great, the speed too violent. The barrier of the Han River Bridge loomed ahead, a jagged wall of reinforced concrete and steel cables. "No," he gasped, his voice swallowed by the roar of the wind. The impact was a symphony of destruction. The front left corner of the sedan clipped the barrier first, the sound of tearing metal like a scream of a dying animal. The airbag exploded in a flash of white powder and searing heat, slamming into Tiang's face and snapping his head back. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of glass shards and spinning gray asphalt. The car began to barrel roll, the centrifugal force pinning Tiang against the seat, his muscular frame tossed around like a rag doll within the luxury cabin. The roof crushed inward, the pillars snapping with the sound of dry wood. Through the shattered windshield, he saw the dark expanse of the Han River rushing up to meet him. It was a descent into a cold, watery abyss. The car struck the embankment with a final, earth-shattering thud, the frame twisting into a grotesque sculpture of ruined ambition. Everything went silent. The roar of the engine was replaced by the hiss of steam and the rhythmic, mocking tick of cooling metal. Tiang lay amidst the wreckage, his sharp, masculine features masked by blood and dust. He could feel the cold morning air rushing through the gaps in the mangled steel, but he couldn't move. He tried to reach for the door handle, but his arm felt like it belonged to someone else, miles away. His vision began to tunnel, the edges of the world turning into a soft, encroaching blackness. His last thought wasn't of his empire or his money or the men who feared him. It was of Sara's face, the way she had looked in the black floral dress, her eyes warm and captivating as she whispered that she loved him. He didn't know that the woman he was dying for was currently checking her watch, waiting for the phone call that would confirm the dragon was finally gone. Darkness surged forward, cold and absolute, pulling the most powerful man and soul into a silent, lightless void. The 200 km/h nightmare had ended, and the long, agonizing silence of Tiang Junseo had begun. The riverbank was a desolate place in the early morning light, a graveyard of concrete and twisted metal shrouded in a rising mist. Zaria Whitmore drove along the upper bridge road, the heater in her modest sedan humming a low, comforting tune against the chill. She was minutes away from starting her double shift at the hospital, her mind occupied by the routine tasks of checking charts and managing IV drips. But then a flicker of movement caught her eye, a glint of sunlight hitting a piece of shattered chrome down in the ravine. Most people would have dismissed it as discarded trash, but Zaria had an instinct honed by years of trauma care. She slowed her car, peering through the fog, and saw the black sedan crumpled against the embankment like a crushed velvet box. Without a second thought for her own safety or the professional attire of her Navy nurse uniform, Zarya pulled to the shoulder and scrambled down the steep, rocky incline. The air down by the water was thick with the acrid smell of burning rubber and leaking coolant. As she reached the wreckage, the sheer violence of the crash became apparent. The car was unrecognizable, its frame twisted into a grotesque knot of obsidian steel. Inside, pinned beneath a crushed dashboard and a deflated, blood-stained airbag, was Tiang. He was shirtless, his powerful chest marred by deep lacerations, but it was the tattoos that caught Zarya's breath. The dragon and the serpent, symbols of a life lived in a world she only knew from headlines. Even in his shattered state, he possessed a terrifying, magnetic beauty. His eyes were closed, his sharp, masculine jawline slack, and his skin was a ghostly, translucent gray. Zarya pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. For a terrifying 10 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the river. Then a pulse, faint, thready, and desperate, fluttered against her fingertips. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "I've got you, don't you dare let go." She knew she couldn't move him. The risk of spinal injury was too great. Instead, she used her own sweater to staunch the heavy bleeding from a wound on his temple, pressing her weight against the jagged metal. She stayed there for what felt like hours, talking to him, telling him about the morning sun and the shift she was supposed to be starting, anything to keep his spirit tethered to the broken vessel of his body. When the paramedics finally arrived, they looked at the mangled wreckage and then at Zarya, their expressions grim. "There's no way," one whispered, shaking his head. "Look at the cabin compression. He's gone." "He is not gone," Zarya snapped, her gentle demeanor replaced by a fierce, unyielding authority. "I have a pulse. Get the jaws of life and get him out of there now." The fight continued at the hospital, a sterile battlefield of white lights and the rhythmic hissing of ventilators. Tiang was rushed into emergency surgery, a team of specialists working frantically to repair the internal damage. Zarya stood behind the glass of the observation deck, her hands still stained with his blood, watching the man she had pulled from the brink. When the lead surgeon finally emerged, he didn't offer a smile. He spoke of cerebral edema, of grade IV axonal injury, and a prognosis that was darker than the river he had fallen into. "He's in a deep coma, Zarya," the surgeon said, removing his mask. "The brain scans show minimal activity. Even if he survives the night, he'll be a vegetable. It's a mercy to let him go before the swelling gets worse." But as the days turned into weeks, Zarya became the lone dissenter in a chorus of defeat. The hospital administration began to discuss end-of-life protocols, noting the lack of family presence and the staggering cost of his long-term care. Sora and Hyunsik would visit occasionally, putting on a grand display of grief for the staff, but Zarya noticed the way Sora's eyes flickered to the monitors with a cold, impatient hunger. They weren't praying for a recovery, they were waiting for a funeral. Zarya refused to let the world give up on the dragon. She spent her breaks in his room, which the staff had dubbed the Ghost Ward. She talked to him, not as a patient, but as a man. She read him the news, played soft music, and meticulously massaged his hands to prevent the muscles from atrophying. She saw the man behind the tattoos, the vulnerability beneath the strength. One night, a senior doctor caught her adjusting Tiang's blankets at 3:00 a.m. "You're wasting your heart on a corpse, Nurse Whitmore," the doctor said, his voice weary. "He can't hear you, he can't feel you, he's just a machine-assisted body now." "You're wrong," Zarya replied, her deep brown eyes shining with a quiet, stubborn light. "He's still in there, he's a fighter, he just needs someone to hold the door open for him." The struggle was exhausting, a lonely vigil against the encroaching darkness of medical indifference and the hidden malice of his betrayers. Zarya became Tiang's only shield, his only voice in a world that had already written his obituary. She didn't know his name or his sins, but she knew his soul was still clawing at the edges of the abyss. As she sat by his bed, holding his large, scarred hand in her own, the angel in blue made a silent vow. She would be the one to lead him back, even if she had to fight the entire world to do it. She didn't realize that deep within the silence of his mind, Tiang was starting to listen to the sound of her voice, and for the first time since the crash, the dragon began to stir. The sterile silence of the private ICU wing was a thin veil, easily torn by the sharp, arrogant clicks of polished heels and luxury loafers. It was 3 a.m, the hour when the hospital felt most like a graveyard, Yet Sora Minyi and Hyunsik Daryu walked the halls with the energy of people arriving at a victory gala. They didn't bother to lower their voices as they approached Tiang's room. To them, the man inside was no longer a person. He was a safe they had finally found the combination to. Inside the room, Tiang lay beneath the pale blue glow of the vitals monitor. His powerful chest was bare, the grand dragon tattoo appearing to writhe with every mechanical hiss of the ventilator. To any doctor, he was a statue of meat and bone. But inside, the darkness was no longer empty. Tiang was awake. He was trapped behind his own eyelids, his consciousness a jagged blade of ice. He heard the door swing open. He smelled the familiar, expensive scent of Sora's perfume, a scent he had once associated with home, now the stench of a predator. "Look at him," Sora whispered, though her voice carried no reverence. "The great dragon of soul, reduced to a heap of expensive scars. He's never looked more pathetic." Tiang felt the bed dip as Sora leaned over him. He felt her cold, slender fingers brush against the dragon tattoo on his chest, tracing the ink with a mocking touch. He wanted to roar, to wrap his hands around her throat, but his body remained a stone prison. He was forced to listen as Hyunsik let out a short, sharp laugh. "He always was a show-off," Hyunsik said, his voice dripping with the jealousy he had hidden for decades. "Building an empire just to buy you jewelry. He worked so hard for all that wealth, and now he's just going to hand it over without even a whimper." "Don't be so dramatic, Hyunsik," Sora replied, her tone turning businesslike. "He isn't handing it over, we're taking it. Did you bring the device?" Tiang felt a cold, metallic sensation against his right hand. Hyunsik reached out and grabbed Tiang's wrist, lifting his arm with a callous lack of care, as if he were moving a piece of furniture. The grip was tight, bruising the skin that Zarya had spent weeks gently moisturizing. "The biometric scanner is ready," Hyunsik muttered. "The Swiss accounts require a live thermal print. If he dies before we get this, the board of directors will lock the vaults for years. We need that access tonight." Tiang felt his thumb being forced onto a flat glass surface. The device hummed, a low, electronic vibration that felt like a sting against his nerve endings. He fought with every ounce of his will to pull his hand back, to curl his fingers into a fist, but the connection between his mind and his muscles was still a severed wire. He lay there, shirtless and exposed, while the two people he had loved most treated his body like a tool. "Success," Sora breathed, the triumph in her voice making Tiang's skin crawl. "The transfer codes are generating. By tomorrow morning, the offshore holdings will be in our names. The syndicate won't even know the money is gone until we've already liquidated the assets." Hyunsik dropped Tiang's arm. It hit the mattress with a heavy, lifeless thud. "We should celebrate, Sora. He's basically already dead. The doctors are just waiting for the paperwork to stop the machines." Then came the ultimate insult. Tiang heard the rustle of Sora's silk dress as she turned toward Hyunsik. He heard the sound of a deep, lingering kiss, a wet, passionate exchange that happened inches from his own face. It was a desecration of his sanctuary, a final spit on the grave of his dignity. "I can't wait to be rid of this place," Sora whispered against Hyunsik's lips. "I'm tired of playing the grieving widow. I want to wear white. I want the world to see us together, standing on the ruins of his kingdom." "Soon, my queen," Hyunsik replied, his voice arrogant and predatory. "One more month. We'll have the wedding he never gave you. We'll spend his gold on a celebration that will make his reign look like a footnote in history." They laughed together, a hollow, cruel sound that echoed in the small room. Sora leaned down one last time, her lips brushing Tiang's ear, her breath hot and sickening. "Goodbye, Tiang," she hissed. "Thank you for the diamonds. They'll look much better on me when I'm standing at the altar with a man who actually knows how to use them." The door clicked shut, leaving Tiang in the humming silence of the machines. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of a victim. The heist of his fingerprints was the final catalyst. The rage that had been a flickering coal in his chest had grown into a white-hot furnace. He had heard their wedding plans. He had felt their mockery. He had watched them steal his life's work while he was supposed to be a corpse. Hidden in the corner of his eye, beneath the heavy lid Sora thought would never open again, a single hot tear of fury escaped. It tracked slowly down his temple, disappearing into his hair. The villains had taken his money, his empire, and his dignity, but they had forgotten one thing. They had left the dragon alive, and they had given him a reason to claw his way back from the abyss. The heist was over, but the recording was complete. Tiang Junseo was no longer just waiting to survive. He was waiting for the day he could walk into their celebration and turn their wedding into a funeral. And somewhere in the hallway, the sound of Zarya's soft, rhythmic footsteps approached. The only person in the world who knew that the man they had just robbed was the most dangerous enemy they would ever face. The shift changed at 4:00 a.m., leaving the hallways of the hospital bathed in a ghostly, fluorescent hum. Zarya entered room 402, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, sealing out the world of indifference and betrayal. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. She preferred the soft, amber glow of the equipment monitors, which cast long, dancing shadows across Tiang's muscular frame. She noticed the dampness on his temple immediately, a single, salt-stained track that hadn't been there an hour ago. To a casual observer, it was a physiological reflex. To Zarya, it was a scream. She moved to the side of his bed, her movements fluid and practiced. She didn't start with the blood pressure cuff or the IV bag. Instead, she took his hand, the same hand Hyunsik had treated like a piece of dead weight, and held it between her own. "They're gone, Tiang," she whispered, her voice a warm balm in the cold room. "I saw them leave. I saw the way they looked at you. I know they aren't your family. I know they're the reason you're in this bed." She felt a microscopic change in the air, a tension that vibrated through the bedside rails. For weeks, she had been talking into a void, but tonight the void was humming back. She leaned closer, her deep brown eyes searching his face with a desperate, hopeful intensity. "If you can hear me," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs, "give me a sign, just one. Don't let them win." Tiang's world was a storm of static and fire. Every muscle felt as though it were fused with lead, yet the sound of Zarya's voice acted like a lighthouse in the dark. He remembered her from the wreckage, the angel in blue, who had promised not to let go. He felt the warmth of her palms against his skin, a stark contrast to the icy, predatory touch of Sora. With a Herculean effort that felt like dragging a mountain through sand, Tiang forced his focus to his right hand. He visualized the neurons firing, the spark jumping across the shattered gaps of his nervous system. Zarya gasped. It was barely a movement, a slight, deliberate squeeze of her index finger, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Oh, thank God," she sobbed quietly, a single tear falling onto his scarred forearm. "You're in there, you're really in there." Tiang's eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of the sedation. Slowly, agonizingly, they opened. His dark, intense eyes were bloodshot and clouded, but the fire inside them was unmistakable. He couldn't speak. The ventilator tube in his throat saw to that. But as his gaze locked onto Zarya, a silent language was born. It was a communication stripped of the lies and grandiosity of his former life. In that look, he gave her his pain, his fury, and a plea for help that no Mafia boss would ever utter aloud. Zarya understood instantly. She didn't call for the doctors. She knew that if the hospital staff recorded his recovery, the news would reach Sora within the hour. If Tiang were to survive the next month, he had to stay a ghost. She leaned over him, her face inches from his. "We have to be smart," she whispered, her intelligence and intuition working at lightning speed. "The monitors. I can't let them show your heart rate spiking when they're in the room. I'm going to tweak the sensors. I'm going to tell the doctors your condition is stable but declining. Do you understand?" Tiang blinked once. "Yes." "I'm going to bring you back, Tiang. Not for the syndicate, and not for the money they're stealing. I'm bringing you back so you can look them in the eye when you take it all back." Over the next few nights, their bond deepened in the sacred hours between midnight and dawn. Zarya became more than his nurse. She became his shadow and his strategist. She began to bring in small, high-protein supplements disguised in standard feeding bags to rebuild his wasted muscle. She spent hours performing passive, physical therapy under the guise of routine cleaning, moving his limbs to keep the blood flowing, whispering instructions on how to breathe through the pain. The emotional intimacy of those hours was unlike anything Tiang had ever experienced. In his world, intimacy was a transaction, diamonds for smiles, loyalty for protection. But Zarya wanted nothing. She risked her career, her safety, and her peace for a man the world had discarded. She told him about her life, about the grandmother who taught her that a healer's hands are a sacred trust, and about the quiet dreams she had outside the hospital walls. For Tiang, the silence was a revelation. For the first time, he wasn't the dragon who had to provide. He was just a man who was being seen. He watched the way the light caught the natural curls of her dark hair, the way her smooth, deep brown skin glowed with a genuine humanity he hadn't known existed. He began to realize that the life he had built with Sora was a hollow monument to his own ego. The real empire wasn't made of glass and steel. It was made of the trust he was building with this woman in the dead of night. They developed a code for the complex plan ahead. 1 blink for yes, 2 for no, and a sustained gaze for danger. As he regained the ability to swallow and take shallow breaths on his own, they began the most dangerous phase, the secret weaning from the machines. Zarya would manually adjust the ventilator settings, forcing his lungs to do the work while she stood guard at the door. Every breath was a battle, every movement a victory. "They're planning the wedding," she told him one night, her voice steady despite the horror of the news. "It's in 3 weeks. They've already moved most of the offshore funds. They think you're a memory, Tiang." He looked at her, his jaw tightening, his defined masculine features returning as the swelling in his face finally subsided. He didn't blink. He reached out, his hand trembling but certain, and touched the fabric of her navy sleeve. It was a promise. The plan for his recovery was no longer just about survival. It was a masterpiece of patient, silent vengeance. Zarya would be his hands and feet, and he would be the mind that orchestrated the fall of the house of cards Sora and Hyunsik had built. In the sterile, amber-lit room, the Mafia boss and the nurse were no longer 2 different people from 2 different worlds. They were a single force of nature, planning a resurrection that the city of Seoul would never forget. The secret language was complete, and as Zarya squeezed his hand before the sun rose, Tiang knew that the dragon wasn't just waking up. He was learning how to fly again, fueled by a loyalty that no amount of diamonds could ever buy. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of bruised slate, a cold wind whipping through the spires of Seoul's most prestigious cathedral. Inside, the atmosphere was a suffocating display of stolen opulence. Thousands of white lilies, paid for with the blood money Sora had siphoned from Tiang's offshore accounts, lined the center aisle like rows of silent, pale witnesses. The elite of the city, businessmen, corrupt officials, and high-ranking syndicate members, filled the pews, their whispers creating a low hum of anticipation. They were here to witness the union that would officially close the chapter on the dragon's reign, sealing the crown onto the heads of the traitors. Sora Minyi stood at the back of the sanctuary, a vision of calculated perfection in a custom-made lace gown that flowed behind her like a river of ivory. Her chestnut brown hair was pinned up with a tiara that sparkled with the blue diamonds Tiang had gifted her, a final, mocking trophy of her victory. Beside her, Hyunsik checked his luxury watch, his jet-black hair slicked back with an arrogance that bordered on the divine. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than a family home, his sharp, narrow eyes scanning the crowd with the hunger of a man who had finally reached the summit. They looked at each other and shared a knowing, cold smile. The accident was a memory. The hospital room was a nightmare they had left behind. They were untouchable. The organ music swelled, a triumphant, soaring melody that signaled the start of the procession. Sora began her walk, her graceful posture radiating a confidence that fooled every eye in the room. She looked toward the altar, where the priest stood ready to bless a union built on a foundation of betrayal and murder. Everything was going according to the script. The wealth was transferred, the security was loyal to Hyunsik, and the man who should have been standing where Hyunsik stood was supposed to be a pile of ash in a crematorium. Then the music died. It didn't fade out. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the cathedral. The heavy, ornate oak doors at the rear of the sanctuary didn't just open, they thundered. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings like a crack of doom, stopping Sora in her tracks. The congregation turned as one, a collective gasp rippling through the pews like a physical wave. Standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh, gray light of the storm outside, was a ghost. Tiang Junseo did not look like a man who had spent months in a coma. He stood tall, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the doorway, his chest held high beneath a sharp, midnight black suit. His sharp, masculine facial structure, once hollowed by injury, was now defined by a terrifying, cold resolve. His dark and intense eyes, once trapped behind closed lids, were wide open and fixed on the woman in white. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need one. His very presence was a lethal force. Beside him, standing with a quiet, unyielding dignity, was Zarya. She was no longer in her Navy nurse uniform. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress, her smooth, deep brown skin glowing against the backdrop of the stone cathedral. She wasn't there as a bodyguard. She was there as the witness, the woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death with him and led him back to the light. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, ringing void. Sora's bouquet of lilies hit the marble floor with a soft thud, the petals scattering like broken promises. Her face, so recently flushed with triumph, turned the color of ash. Her hands began to shake so violently that the lace of her sleeves fluttered. "Ti-Young," she stammered, her voice a thin, ragged whisper that carried to the very back of the hall. Hyun-sik stepped forward, his face twisting in a mask of horror and disbelief. "No, that's impossible. You're dead. We saw the reports. We saw the paperwork." Tiang began to walk. Each step was slow, deliberate, and heavy, the sound of a king reclaiming his throne. The guests shrank back into their pews as he passed, the aura of power he carried more stifling than it had ever been before the crash. He stopped 10 feet from the altar, his gaze shifting from Sora to the man he had once called brother. "You should have made sure the brakes were the only thing you cut, Hyun-sik," Tiang said. His voice was no longer the gravelly rasp of the hospital room. It was the deep, resonant baritone of the dragon, vibrating with a cold, focused fury. "Because while you were busy celebrating my death, I was busy listening to your plans. I heard the laughter. I felt the touch of your hands on my skin as you stole my legacy. I heard the wedding date you set while I was supposedly a corpse." Hyun-sik reached for his waistband, his hand fumbling for the concealed firearm he always carried, but Tiang didn't flinch. "Don't," Tiang warned, his dark eyes flashing with a lethality that froze Hyun-sik's blood. "Look behind you." The side doors of the cathedral burst open, and a contingent of the syndicate's most loyal veterans, men who had served Tiang's father before him, poured into the sanctuary. Behind them came the police, led by a detective holding a tablet. "The mechanic talked, Sora," Zarya said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the rising panic like a bell. "And we have the recordings from the hospital room. Every word you said while you thought he couldn't hear you. It's all here." Sora looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. The elite of Seoul, the people she had cultivated so carefully, were now looking at her with disgust. The queen was stripped bare in front of her subjects. She looked at Tiang, trying to find a spark of the man who had bought her diamonds and worshipped her every move, but she found only a stranger. "Tiang, please," she sobbed, taking a stumbling step toward him. "I was scared. I didn't know what I was doing. Hyun-sik forced me." "Enough," Tiang commanded, the single word silencing her more effectively than a blow. He looked at the blue diamond tiara on her head, the last gift of a man who no longer existed. "You didn't just try to kill me, Sora. You tried to erase me, but you forgot that a dragon doesn't die just because you've taken its gold." He turned his back on them, a gesture of absolute dismissal that was more painful than any bullet. As the police moved in to arrest the bride and groom at the very altar of their betrayal, Tiang walked back toward Zarya. The heavy oak doors remained open, the gray light of the morning now feeling like the first real dawn he had seen in years. The ghost at the cathedral was a ghost no longer. He was a man reborn, and as he reached Zarya and felt the warmth of her hand in his, he knew that the revenge was only a formality. The real victory was the woman standing by his side, and the new life that was waiting for them beyond the stone walls of his past. The cold, sanctified air of the cathedral was quickly replaced by the clinical, sharp efficiency of justice. As the police led Sora and Hyun-sik away, their expensive wedding finery now a mocking costume of their failed ambition, Tiang did not watch them go. He did not need the satisfaction of seeing the handcuffs click shut or hearing Sora's desperate, hollow pleas for mercy. The man who had once ruled through fear and the crushing weight of his thumb felt a strange, light sensation in his chest. It was the feeling of a debt finally settled, not with blood, but with the truth. In the weeks that followed, the syndicate underwent a transformation that mirrored its leader's own resurrection. Tiang did not return to the dark alleys or the backroom deals. Instead, he used the very code Sora had tried to steal to liquidate the underworld assets of the Junseo Empire. He turned the shipping docks into legitimate commerce hubs and converted his protection funds into a foundation for urban redevelopment. The dragon hadn't died. He had simply shed his skin. He moved out of the mansion that smelled of betrayal and into a modest, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the city he now looked at with protective, rather than predatory, eyes. Zarya remained the constant in his new life. She had returned to her shifts at the hospital, refusing the financial rewards Tiang tried to offer her for saving his life. "I didn't pull you out of that car for a paycheck, Tiang," she had told him with that same quiet, unyielding dignity. "I did it because you were a man who wasn't finished yet." A year to the day after the crash on the Han River Bridge, the Seoul sky was a brilliant, celebratory blue. Tiang returned to the hospital, but this time he wasn't arriving in the back of an ambulance. He walked through the main entrance in a casual charcoal suit, his broad shoulders relaxed, his dark eyes no longer scanning for enemies, but searching for a single face. He found her in the ICU lounge, just finishing a grueling 12-hour shift. Zarya looked tired, her navy scrubs wrinkled, her long dark curls tied back in a soft bun, but to Tiang, she had never looked more beautiful. She smiled when she saw him, a warm, genuine expression that reached her kind eyes. "You're late for your checkup, Mr. Junseo," she teased, though her voice was soft. "I'm not here for a checkup, Zarya," he replied, stepping closer until he could smell the faint, comforting scent of lavender and antiseptic that always followed her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple box. It wasn't a blue diamond the size of a bird's egg. It wasn't a trophy meant to dazzle the world or buy a smile. Inside was a delicate gold band set with a single, clear sapphire, the color of the morning sky he had seen when she first whispered for him to stay with her. "A year ago, I was a ghost," Tiang said, his voice deep and steady. "I was a man who thought he knew what loyalty was, only to find out I had been living a lie. You gave me more than my breath back. You gave me a reason to be a man worth saving." He sank to one knee on the linoleum floor of the hospital lounge, right there in the place where he had once been invisible to everyone but her. The nurses passing by slowed their pace, and the rhythmic beeping of the distant monitors felt like a heartbeat. "Zarya Whitmore, you were my witness when I had no voice. Will you be my wife now that I have a life worth sharing?" Zarya's hands flew to her mouth, her smooth, deep brown skin glowing under the hospital lights. For a moment, the silence of the ICU was filled with the weight of a year's worth of shared secrets, whispered vows, and secret recoveries. She looked at the ring, then at the man who had traded an empire for the chance to stand beside her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice a beautiful, clear bell. "1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Tiang realized that the ruthless mafia boss who had once ruled through fear had finally discovered a power far greater than any syndicate. He had found a loyalty that couldn't be sabotaged and a love that didn't require a mask. The dragon had found his sanctuary, not in a mansion of gold, but in the heart of the woman who had seen him when he was invisible. The final redemption was complete, and as they walked out of the hospital doors together, the sun was high, the world was wide, and for the first time in his life, Tiang Junseo was truly free. Tiang Junseo began his journey ruling an empire built on fear, believing that diamonds could buy loyalty. It took a devastating crash and a silent hospital room to show him that the only thing more powerful than a dragon's fire is the heart of someone who chooses to stay when the rest of the world has walked away. Sometimes, the person who saves your life isn't a soldier or a brother. Sometimes, it's the person who holds your hand at 3:00 a.m. when you have nothing left to give but a single blink of trust. Thank you so much for watching and for being the real MVPs of this channel. If you enjoyed this journey, check out the video on your screen right now for another story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, stay loyal, stay romantic, and remember, the truth always finds a way out of the shadows. Peace out, everyone. I'll see you in the next story.